Hey everyone, John here, testing 25 more Switch 1 games on Switch 2. These are unpatched, just raw backwards compatibility, but as we've learned, they get general enhancements from the hardware. So games that couldn't quite hit 30 or couldn't quite hit 60 generally do now, although there are a few exceptions. Now this video is going to bring my personal testing total to around 70, and Brandon's tested an extra 10, so there's around 80 tests on the channel. And there may be another wave from Steve in the future, but for now, this is the end of my big wave journey. So let's check out 25 games, some that I wanted to check out, and a bunch that are recommended in the comments. So let's check these games out. We're kicking it off with Furi, and when things aren't really happening on Switch 1, the game hangs at around 40 to 45 frames per second, and when things are happening, it's more like 30 to 35, sometimes lower. This was definitely too ambitious for the Switch 1 and was made for PlayStation 4. But Switch 2 bumps this all the way up to a locked 60 FPS. I didn't see a single frame drop in my entire time with Furi, and now I can highly recommend it on Switch 2. Resident Evil 6 is a very similar example. This game has an unlocked frame rate, so can reach 60 FPS, but it basically never does. As you can see in this scene here, we're usually under 30 FPS and only occasionally go over to around 32 FPS, but very, very rarely. And in the opening scene, it's actually drastically worse than that, reaching around 20 FPS, sometimes mid-20s, but never much higher than that. So does Switch 2 iron all of that out? Well, let's start off with the less intensive scene, and yes, this is running at 60 FPS now, more than double what Switch 1 was capable of there. Just a locked 60, no frame drops, beautiful. And that more taxing scene, this one's a little bit more hard to judge because you can see there are dips to 40 there, but you also recognize that those dips happen when Leon blinks. So that's more likely frame data being unavailable in that moment rather than the game dropping frames, because when there's just pure action on screen, it is a locked 60, so I'd say that these aren't really frame drops. And sticking to Resident Evil, this is Revelations 2. And back on Switch 1, this is an uncapped game that does not come close to its 60 target. The footage here isn't even that intensive, this is one of the more easygoing parts of the game, but Switch 1 cannot hit 60 at any moment. Sometimes it gets relatively close, other times it gets pretty darn far. And as you guessed, Switch 2 does iron this out. This is a flat bar the entire time, always 60 frames per second. And this means the entire Resident Evil series runs at 60 FPS on Switch 2, or at least the uncapped ones. So Resident Evil 5, Resident Evil 6, Revelations 1, Revelations 2, all 60 FPS games. And that's awesome. The original S.T.A.L.K.E.R PC trilogy came to Switch last year, and recently I heard someone call these ports bad, and I wasn't really sure why, because for the most part they're very stable, they look pretty good, they run pretty well, but there are a couple of moments where the frame pacing is quite bad. If you look at the frame time here, even though the frame rate is mostly holding 30, there are moments of frames persisting, which can make it feel like there's some judder. And is this fixed on Switch 2? Yeah, he's got a flat line the entire time, those frame pacing issues do not exist, and the game does not try and budge from its 30 target. Even when things get really busy, you're still going to be getting 30 FPS the entire time. Not exactly a miracle for an old PC game, but I think S.T.A.L.K.E.R holds up pretty well visually regardless. Now let's take a look at Tales of Vesperia. And back on Switch 1, in the combat at least, this holds 60 FPS moderately well. It does drop a couple of frames, and there are moments where it gets a bit lower than that, but not for very long. I'd say this is solid for the most part. But then you look at the towns, and this is much less solid, hanging around mid-50s to low 40s. And then you get to the overworld, and it's just like this isn't very good at all. Very unstable and pretty low. Does Switch 2 resolve everything, though? And the answer is, yeah. So in the combat, this is now a lock 60 the entire time. In towns, lock 60 the entire time. And in the overworld, which is the biggest problem area, it is indeed a lock 60. So Tales of Vesperia is now 60 everywhere on the Switch 2, which is a huge bump. Now the other Tales games aren't quite as lucky, as Tales of Symphonia is locked at 30, so Vesperia is the big one to look at here. So very nice results. Now, one of the most commonly requested games in the comments has been Astral Chain. And I've not looked at this yet because I thought the results would be rather boring, and they are rather boring. So Astral Chain is locked at 30 and doesn't budge that much. Sometimes it can drop a frame or two, and there are some specific encounters where it quite commonly drops those frames. And there are occasionally some frame pacing issues, but again, most of the time this game runs fine on the Switch 1. It's only just rare instances where the frames drop. And on Switch 2, it's a very similar story. It's a flat 30 the entire time now. But otherwise, there's not a whole lot more to write home about. This game can't hit 60 FPS without a patch. This is coded at 30. And so you basically just get a more flat-lined Astral Chain. And sticking on the Platinum Games front, because we've looked at Bayonetta 2 and Bayonetta 3, which are both now locked at 60, what about Bayonetta Origins? This is also rather highly recommended. And this game, for the most part, doesn't really drop frames on Switch 1, and it's another 30 FPS capped game. There are occasionally issues with the frame pacing, but again, they're pretty rare. And on Switch 2, it's the same story really, just a flatline 30, not a very exciting one. So there's just two highly requested games out of the way. Let's get to more exciting results. With Pokemon Unite, our tools are not needed because the game itself has a frame rate counter right here in green in the top right. And as you can see, it holds 60 most of the time, but whenever there's a large group of Pokemon, it can get to the mid-40s, it can get lower than that. This game definitely outpaced the Switch 1 with all its updates. And on Switch 2, it is locked at 60 the entire time, doesn't matter what is going on. And interestingly, because this is a cross-platform game between Switch 1 and mobile and Switch 2, Switch 2 loads basically faster than anyone else in the lobby, so you can tell who else is using a Switch 2 by the load times. Most of the time you'll just be chilling there with a full bar, while everyone else is still loading. And just the menus in general are way more pleasant to navigate on Switch 2 than they are Switch 1. They're very laggy, very obtrusive on the Switch 1, whereas now it's all pretty much instant. Now let's go to a funny game. This is Deadly Premonition 2, and we're indoors right now with not much really going on, and the game is dropping frames from 30. But what have I told you? That the actual frame cap is 60. So we're not just dropping frames from 30, we're dropping all the way from 60 in this room that has nothing going on. And then you go outside, and good God, like we're going to 20 FPS, sometimes the teens, sometimes even lower than that. This is one of the worst running games on the Switch 1, just consistently bad the entire time. Never comes close to the 60 target. I've never seen it go above 30, really, even, only a couple of numbers above that number. So does Switch 2 resolve something as bad as this? Well, the initial results are promising. We're indoors, nothing going on, and we are hitting 60 FPS. Not exactly a miracle, but we are hitting the frame cap. But then we go outside and... well, the cutscene here is 60 FPS, depending on the angle. But then we go out skateboarding, an area that would often hit around 20 to 15 FPS on the Switch 1. And we're now getting between 30 and 50 FPS. So it is a major bump. It's now playable, but it's still very inconsistent. So, Deadly Premonition 2, definitely a lot more playable on the Switch 2, but still a very rough game. And not something I can recommend from a technical perspective in the slightest. The Klonoa collection was frankly quite bad on Switch 1. This has a 60 FPS frame cap, but never really hits it. Even in indoor areas where nothing's really happening, you're falling quite far below 60 frames per second. And then you go outside and you're hanging around 40 to 50 most of the time. Definitely not ideal, and these are fantastic games that are really at home on Nintendo, so it's a shame to see them run pretty poorly. Whereas Switch 2 does iron everything out. Klonoa 1 and 2, no matter how busy it gets, are always 60 frames per second. There are no dips recorded in any of my gameplay. Very, very happy about this one. Now let's look at Live Alive on the Switch 1. And these HD 2D games are pretty deceptive in their appearance because they don't look too complex, but they are running a lot of complex lighting. And they are running an Unreal Engine 4 as well, so they're a lot more demanding than they appear to be. And games like Dragon Quest III, as we've seen in the past, do struggle on the Switch 1. And for the most part, Live Alive does give us a flat 30 until we get into combat. And there are certain effects here which are going to make the frame rate dip pretty high. Like using this ice attack is going to take us from 30 FPS all the way down to 22 FPS. And it's not very intrusive, it's turn-based, it won't affect your gameplay at all, but I'd rather not have those drops there. And again, on Switch 2, overworld completely fine, 30 FPS the entire time, and in battle, all those drops are now gone. Doesn't matter what's happening, you are not going to drop down from 30, it will always be a locked 30 FPS. And that's cool. Now back to comment recommendations, the Crash and Spyro games were very highly recommended. So let's start with the N-Sane Trilogy, and honestly, it's fantastic on the Switch One. The resolution is rather low, but the frame rate doesn't really drop from 30 FPS, and the frame time is just constantly pretty clear. These are really good Switch 1 ports, and the Switch 2 can't really do a whole lot more with that. It can't make it 60 FPS. This game isn't even 60 on PlayStation 4 or PS5. Activision just haven't patched it for whatever reasons. There's not really much hope that this is going to become 60. So unfortunately, while the results are good for Switch 1, it doesn't do a whole lot for Switch 2 because this is just stuck at 30. And Crash 4 is very similar to that. This is a bit more impressive for the Switch 1 because this is an Unreal Engine 4 game with a lot more going on, a lot busier scenes, but it rarely drops from 30. There are a couple of moments where the frame time graph does have some spikes, and the Switch 2 does resolve those. This is a flat bar the entire time, so there are marginal improvements, but for the most part, Crash 4 and N-Sane Trilogy don't really change between Switch 1 and Switch 2. And to keep giving the people what they want, here is Spyro Reignited Trilogy. And this one's definitely a bit more rough on Switch 1. The frame time graph is very spiky, and when you do certain effects you are going to drop the frame rate down to around 27 FPS, but it does spend most of the time locked at 30. It's really the frame time graph which gives the illusion of judder, but it's a pretty smooth game all in all. And Switch 2 is not saved from the judder, it's less persistent, but you are still going to see some judder in the frame time graph. Definitely a lot better than Switch 1 was, but it is not free from it. Although back on Switch 1 it's pretty much always happening, whereas Switch 2 is only occasionally happening. And unlike Switch 1, the frame rate did not drop from 30 FPS. It occasionally tries to be 31 or even 32 FPS, but it's never going to go down from 30. So an improvement, but not really much of one. And a game that I really wanted to check out was Harvestella. This is an excellent game. I've played around 20 hours on the Switch 2 because it's just a great chance to re-experience the game. And Switch 1 does have a few performance issues. Even when the game is hitting around 30 FPS, there is some frame time judder. But when on the farm, the game cannot hit a constant 30, especially when you've got a lot of crops on screen. Right here, the farm is fairly empty, there's a few things planted, and the game is running around 26 to 30 frames per second. Rarely hitting 30, quite consistently hitting around 25, 26. These problems persist in the overworld as well, where we're pretty much constantly 25/26 frames per second. Definitely not ideal. And Switch 2 does iron absolutely everything out. This is a constant 30 in the farm, in towns, in dungeons, in the overworld. You're not really going to get any drops in the frame rate. And I also decided to check out a slightly busier farm just to really test the system here. And again, no problems. It does occasionally try to be 31 FPS, but otherwise we are locked at 30 basically the entire time, giving you a much smoother Harvestella, and something that I can highly recommend for those who missed out on the game originally. Now another highly recommended game was Bloodstained, Ritual of the Night. This does drop quite a lot on Switch 1, and the main problem is when transitioning into a new room. The frame rate goes all the way down to around 20 FPS and then jumps back to 30 as frame rate lock. It's very consistent. Every time you go to a new room, it's always going to drop down before coming back up. And I've seen a lot of people say this is better on Switch 2, and honestly, that's not true. The game does drop frames less just in general action, but those frame dips when going to a new room are absolutely still there. As you can see here, we're about to transition to the next area with 30 FPS, and we go down to 22 FPS before jumping back. This happens every time you go to a new room. So I'm not really sure why this is quite commonly listed on the better performers list, because it generally doesn't perform a whole lot better. But let's take a look at Dragon Quest Monsters. When this game came out, the frame rate wasn't very good, but they did patch it to be an awful lot better. There are still problems in the frame time. As you can see here, it's quite constantly giving us frame time spikes. But otherwise, it's running pretty well. A couple of frame drops, but nothing too major, especially because there's a lot of weather effects going on in this scene here. And every now and then you will just get a locked 30. Even with frame time spikes, it is locked at 30. But a big issue comes when transitioning from the seasons. You can see we start off with these grassy fields, and when they go orange, we are dropping down to 23, 22 FPS before it jumps back to 30. Does Switch 2 relieve any of this? The answer is yes. We now have a constantly flat line, no frame time spikes, constantly 30 FPS. But the big stress test is going from one season to the next. And let's take a look. Yeah, nothing happened there. It's just 30 the entire time. No more drops in Dragon Quest Monsters. Again, this is one I can highly recommend for those who missed it. Let's check out a Nintendo game with Endless Ocean, and this is 30 FPS most of the time. Sometimes there's dips when checking out a few of the fish close up, and occasionally you do get frame time spikes. I'm not entirely sure what caused these, because for the most part, the game was running absolutely fine. But the more I played, the more spiky it got, and I couldn't really figure out how to get rid of them. Switch 2, on the other hand, the entire playthrough, same duration played, constantly 30. I can zoom in on the fish, still stays at 30, and frame time spikes never occurred, even when trying to do the exact same things that caused them on Switch 1. Don't know what made that happen. So not really a drastic overhaul, but it does run better. Nier Automata was very highly recommended in the comments section, and this is another game locked at 30, so I wasn't really sure a whole lot could be done. And it's pretty consistent at 30. When just roaming around the overworld and doing general combat, you're not really going to get very many drops. Which was impressive because the PS4 and Xbox One version did drop. They were locked at 60, but they constantly ran around 50 to 40 frames per second, so in many ways Switch was the more consistent console experience. But there were moments where the frame rate could drop, like in the roller coaster section here, just before transitioning to the next scene. You can see the game goes all the way down to around 20 frames per second. It's not a very long drop, but it does happen. And there are just moments where it goes to around 28 frames per second in general, but these are usually pretty small hitches. But does the Switch 2 resolve these drops? As you can see, the answer is pretty much yeah. Oh, by the way, GL and GR are fantastic in this game. I've always found that using your turret gives you a bit of a claw grip, but you can just put them on GL and GR, and it's a lot easier. But yeah, for the most part, this is a locked 30 FPS when exploring, when in combat. But let's go to the same roller coaster scene here, and we're locked at 30 most of the time. When those fireworks appear right before the transition, we do still get a frame drop. We're going from 30 down to 27 frames per second. So it's nothing like 22, you probably won't even notice, to be honest, but it does happen. So this game isn't entirely flawless, and it could do with just the Switch 2 edition to give us less low-resolution textures, but this is still a very nice way to play Nier Automata. This is one that I was really curious about. This is Ghostrunner, an awesome game from 3D Realm, something I highly recommend playing. But the Switch 1 version is rather inconsistent, and quite commonly runs at around 32 frames per second. But there is a lot of judder in the frame time graph, and it's just constantly going between 32 to around 29 FPS, which doesn't feel very smooth. And Switch 2's story isn't too different. There aren't as many spikes in the frame time graph, but they are still there. And this remains quite a juddery game, still bouncing back and forth between 32 and 30 FPS. It's definitely smoother, but not the transformative experience I was hoping for. I thought this would become a flat 30 or a flat 32, but that is not the case. This is still quite a juddery experience, and that's a huge shame. And how about Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3? This is a Switch exclusive, so you can't play it anywhere else, and is 30 FPS capped, so you can't expect a big overhaul in the frame rate. And there are moments where the frame time graph does have spikes, and there are moments where the game drops from 30 FPS down to around 26 FPS. It's not actually that uncommon, sometimes 24 FPS even. So does the Switch 2 resolve that? The answer is yeah! This is now just a flat 30, no frame time spikes, no frame drops, pretty much flawless Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3. Another one that could do with the Switch 2 edition, as I imagine this will play a lot better at 60 FPS, but it is good as it is for now. This is a much better way to play Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3. And probably one of the most highly requested games was Persona 5 Royal, and again, it's kind of a boring one, because this is capped at 30 frames per second. So there's not a whole lot more you can do with this game, and it doesn't really drop frames. So just to demonstrate, this is 30 FPS most of the time. It can drop if you're fast-forwarding in battle, but who cares at that point? And yeah, Switch 2 does resolve that. It's just 30 most of the time. When fast-forwarding, you might still drop a frame or two, but it's so rare. So this is capped at 30. I'm sorry, comments, this is a boring one. So I want to check out a less boring one, which is Persona 5 Strikers, another Muso game. And this is one of the more consistent Musos. It's 60 on PlayStation 4, but 30 on Switch. And it does drop frames on Switch, but not as badly as many other Musos do. So you will notice there are still some pretty severe drops. We are hitting 22 FPS there, but it's for a very slight moment, and it bounces all the way back to 30. So it's nowhere near as bad as something like Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. You are hitting 30 most of the time, but it's still a pretty rocky 30. And yeah, Switch 2, constantly 30, never really dropping. That bar is just boring. Boring bar, just 30 FPS. Nothing really to say about this one. And we're ending off with Wolfenstein 2. And this game is actually a lot more stable than I remember it being. This is one of the last levels in the game. It gets quite busy at times. And we are hitting 30 FPS with basically no drops. Every now and then there's a frame drop or two, but it never gets that bad. And there are more busy moments in this game, like New Orleans, where it can get much lower than this. But in just general gameplay, you're not really going to expect very many frame drops. It's a surprisingly stable Switch 1 game for how ambitious it is. And the same is true on Switch 2, just 30 FPS all the time. So I think this is actually way more impressive than it gets credit for. But it is quite a blurry game. So is the image quality better on Switch 2 than it is Switch 1? Let's take a peek. And I think the answer is yeah. It seems that Switch 2 is using the higher end of dynamic resolution scaling, so Wolfenstein 2 does look better on Switch 2 than it does Switch 1, even if the frame rate is still pretty much consistently 30 FPS the entire game. So again, not the most exciting result, but a great result for image quality. And those are 25 more Switch 2 frame rate results. I am sorry that some of them were a bit boring, but they were constantly requested in the comments, so I thought I'd better show you guys to make you stop requesting them. That's one thing to understand. If a game is locked at 30, it will not budge from 30. It's not going to go to 60. A patch is needed for that stuff. So games like Crash and Spyro aren't magically going to be better on Switch 2. But we've still got some pretty exciting games to recommend playing on Switch 2 here. Resident Evil 6, Revelations 2, Tales of Vesperia, Harvestella, Klonoa, these are all drastically better on the new console. So thank you so much for watching everybody, and I will catch you next time. Bye bye.